And her status changes as she's now low ranking and she has another kid. The status of the kid and the mother will be different. What about the placentas? Do the placentas go with the flow or not? And what about the placentas? What about the status in those offspring whose position has been altered from one sibling to the next? What happens when they grow up and start having offspring of their own, assuming their social status continues? And what are the mechanisms? How early in pregnancy do these changes start occurring? So we have a number of things to look at, and ICHD is putting $55 million into placental research because at the human level, because nobody really knows how they develop and what they do and what processes are changing during development. We can do the same thing in our monkeys. And we can run a number of experiments. I already mentioned the first. We can look at experimental manipulation of status at any point in development and across generations and across successive breeding seasons. We also can address questions that a number of people more in the social demographic and epidemiology world are looking at, and that is in human populations, you can have SES differences or social gradient differences that are either very sharp, where the richest in a society or in a group are much richer than the poorest, or others where that variance is much less, where they're much more tightly packed in the cases of the wealthiest and the poorest. Difference between US and Scandinavia, for example, on a national scale. And that, the epidemiologists and the demographers are telling us, has real consequences for health, both at the individual level, in terms of social gradients, and for society as a whole. And the basic finding at Michael Marmot's work, for example, strongly suggests that the smaller the gradient, the better the overall health and well-being of that particular society or culture is going to be. Well, what about the monkeys? We know that across different species of macaques, rhesus are at one extreme, highly despotic, to use Bernard Terry's term, whereas species like Barbary macaques or Tonkanen macaques are much more egalitarian, where there's much less difference between the highest and lowest ranking individuals. So we can look at across species, but we can also look within species, within rhesus monkey groups. Some, even those in the lab, are much more widely spread in terms of the status differences than are others. What are the health consequences and well-being consequences for them, and what happens to their offspring? And finally, can you manipulate that experimentally so you can start demonstrating causal relationships? And assuming we find the answer to 2 is yes, then it makes sense to go into number 3. So these are some of the things that looking at social status instead of early patterns of parenting behavior can allow us to look at the relationship between behavioral and biological and epigenetic outcomes under circumstances that can be studied very carefully over time and under experimental control. And hopefully, some of the results we'll see will have some human applications and implications as well. And even though I have 5 minutes to spare, I think we merit some discussion. So I'll just close by saying these are some of the people who have contributed to the body of work over the years. And here's my lab as it's presently constituted. We couldn't do any of this work without them, and only a few of the many collaborators who are listed here. I certainly thank them for their time and effort, and I thank you for your time and attention.
You go ahead and have a seat here.
What? Have a seat?
So let's take a question for Steve, but we also want Ann and George to come up. We're going to open this up for about 15 minutes of questions for resilience, flexibility, and reversibility before we move into our panel discussion. So let's use the microphones for these questions, and then we'll move ahead to our panel. Steve, why don't you give me that microphone? Take this.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, get it off.
Here, you take it out. So who would like to start? Anybody got a burning question? Well, if no one's going to start, I'll start. Ann, can you tell us a little bit more? You were rushed a little bit in your talk. A little bit more about the intervention that you are working on, and just some more details and how it's going, and how the community is responding and so forth.
Sure. Well, we're trying to develop it through an iterative process, and the work was funded by the Institute for Educational Sciences because there is a lot of concern about achievement disparities in this country. And, we are trying to develop something that, as I mentioned, will be practical for these highly mobile children, which means that it's very difficult to intervene with a strategy that requires 2 years of intervention or 12 months of intervention for them. The most important thing for families in a shelter environment is to stabilize their environment in good quality housing with good quality care available for their children. But we are catching them in transit, and often their children enter school right while they're staying in a shelter environment. And my department, the early childhood folks, have collaborated with the shelter over time to create early childhood programs that are very accessible to them. They have priority for Head Start, but there's no space. None of the programs with good quality early childhood education have slots available for these children coming through so quickly. So we want to create something practical that could be implemented in a short period of time. Programs like Tools of the Mind is a wonderful intervention for child development, and particularly does well with executive function skills. However, we don't have the luxury of that kind of time. So we're just trying to give a short-term boost to see if we can facilitate these top-down control skills, and we're doing it through several strategies developed with experts in those various areas. One strategy is classroom curriculum in the programs where these children are attending little early childhood programs. And we've focused our intervention on 3 to 5-year-olds because that's going to give them the boost before they enter regular preschool or kindergarten programs. And those include, our model is based on trying to boost reflection training in various different ways, and it's based on a lot of the theoretical perspectives of Phil Zalazzo, as well as some of the mindfulness types out there in the field. And we train teachers. We've developed strategies to just try to tweak regular classroom activities so that they enhance that sort of focused practice on reflection. We worked with the Music Together folks. That's an international curriculum, a wonderful musical program. We developed, with some experts in their program, methods to try to boost up the reflection training and cognitive flexibility practicing in the Music Together songs. And we've created like a manual that goes along with a segment of their songs, and that's part of both the classroom curriculum and family activities. We implemented a kind of family fun night. The last thing people in shelters need is more work to do. Life is a lot of work for these families, and so we created a family intervention to basically educate parents about little things you can do every day that help practice some of these self-control skills. And increasingly, they're asking questions about stress and about sleep. Sleep is a huge problem. We've become very interested in sleep regulation, and we've had some success with kids wearing actigraphers, and we're just beginning to analyze that data. And then we have one-on-one coaching. Some of the children are so delayed or having so much struggle with these reflective skills, and that they can't even absorb the curriculum very well. They have trouble participating, and so we have a little more intensive program working with them. And we're just, trying to improve it iteration upon iteration and trying to monitor whether we're having success. In a classroom, we're trying to show that you're changing that people are actually implementing the intervention, but also that you're changing the classroom functioning. And in the kids, we're specifically targeting changes in various executive function measures and batteries. So I think we're in the midst of more iterative changes, but I hope that we'll be able to do an efficacy trial in the not too distant future. And it would be really exciting to be able to measure change at more of the biological levels that we've heard about here. Yeah.
I directed to George kind of a little bit about clarification, because you were talking about how in your conceptualization, a strategy isn't necessarily adaptive or maladaptive. It has costs and benefits of any particular strategy. And when you were talking about regulatory flexibility, I felt like you were, and maybe I'm mistaken, that you were saying that that people with high flexibility are basically doing better. And so I wondered a little bit about that. And then the second part of the question would be that as part of that model you were saying, there's a lot of feedback. You change your strategies and things like that. But how do you reconcile that with kind of clinical issues or even non-clinical, where people are just saying avoidant attachment and have a hard time, but their strategy is to minimize and to kind of suppress or kind of restrict emotion, and how that might be beneficial at one point in time, but not so much beneficial later on.
Okay. The bit about why flexibility is adaptive, that part was really that in all the measures that we've tried to develop have always been about kind of doing multiple things or doing different things. And I think they're actually too simple. We're trying to do more complex measures now, but say the expressive flexibility was the idea that you either sometimes show a lot of emotion or sometimes conceal a lot of emotion. And I see people, anecdotally, we see people who can't really do that. And the data really does sort of bear it out. So that's really what we're getting. And now we're doing studies where we're trying to get more sophisticated, where we're having people do something over a period of time and we're measuring how many things they do. And just doing a lot of strategies is not necessarily adaptive. It could mean you have no idea what the hell's going on. You're just trying everything. But it's about ability. It's about the ability to do different things. And that's where I was trying to hit on some of the ideas that came up yesterday about you might develop a propensity for whatever reason, either because you're good at something or because you're adapting to your environment. And the question is, can you not do that in another situation? There's so many contexts like that, like military deployment or being in a hostile environment growing up, and then you're not in that environment, or can you readapt? That was really, so the idea is being able to do other things. And I think it's a little agnostic about the adaptability, because it's really, we've been doing this empirically. So the feedback part, I think it's really just another piece of the flexibility, that you get the feedback to something not working. It may be that the feedback is useless if you can't do anything else, if you can't switch. And there may be people who are extremely rigid. I've always felt that the way attachment, I think a lot of what we measure by questionnaire ends up being overly simplistic. And I tend to feel that way about attachment scales. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, but so when you measure people behavior in situations, you get a lot more complexity. And so I think there are people who are less able to modify what they're doing, but I don't think they're that, I think the idea that you can't do anything else is probably a pretty extreme part of the continuum. So that's really where the idea is heading, yeah.
Could I add a comment?
And I'd like to follow up with the question.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in a child framework that the issue has come up in our discussions about whether we want to intervene. How do we know that we're trying to do something that won't be maladaptive in one context, even though it's adaptive in another? And one of the issues we face in really disadvantaged children is that we want them to succeed in a regular school context where a completely different set of skills is required than in some of these chaotic home environments that they're growing up in, or in the neighborhood. And when you see naturally occurring good adaptation, whether it's bicultural adaptation or it's kind of being comfortable and doing well on the street as well as doing well in a school environment, those young people often have a lot of flexibility and capacity for monitoring, or someone else is looking out for them, providing kind of external guidance. And it's, not everything we might want a kid to do in a middle-class school environment is going to work out there in the dangerous streets.
So I was intrigued by your notion of, I can't remember the exact term, sort of early inoculation or experience with mild stressors preparing you for being able to adapt.
Yeah,
in both,
well, I mean,
in
I think
both
there's
cases,
good
and some
primate
very,
data on that.
Very good
Yeah.
primate work, and the question in the primate work suggests that certain types of preparations for upcoming stressors, like early experience with separation when it's going to be permanent later on, how do you deal with that? And that some of these things, timing is crucial, that the same experience that can have long-term inoculating effects may actually have long-term adverse consequences if they have, if it's overly done or if it's at the wrong developmental point. And do we know anything more about the rules that follow those sorts of things, and how would we come to better understand those processes?
I think this area with children is just beginning, and I mean, I think people have intuitively understood it. It comes up in the form of worrying about overprotecting kids, helicopter parenting, and that sort of thing. But I think parents have recognized for a long time that, you know, kids need practice with dealing with things on their own, and they need to, you know, learn how to fall safely if they're learning to ice skate. They need to learn how to separate. And I think some of the best data on that, I'm certainly no expert, is experience going, just separations of babysitters and going off to daycare and that sort of thing. It's not so easy to go to school cold if you've never left, you know, your parents' side. And so there's that kind of data. There's also a whole different literature on preparing children for anticipated stressors. That's old information about, you know, at what age can you prepare a child for the separations of hospitalization or medical treatments and that sort of thing. But, you know, there's some things you can do cognitively, but children having some practice, but it is, from every study I've ever looked at, it looks very nonlinear. It looks like some challenge, some stressors are positive, but then you move rapidly into a counterproductive phase. And I assume it's developmentally very sensitive, just the way we know that it is in primates with separation, and we also know that it is with things like developing protection from asthma. It matters when you're exposed to microorganisms. If you're exposed late, the same microorganisms can trigger really bad reactions. If you're exposed early, it can you know, develop a stronger immune system.
I really appreciate your perspective on it being a process, as well as the idea that these are context-dependent protective effects. Coming from a developmental and genetic background, but something that I wanted to ask you, or I guess the question I wanted to pose, I'm thinking about researching these pathways and the trajectories that you were mentioning. Do you think that maybe we're measuring them too far apart? Yearly, semesterly measurement is not necessarily getting at these processes that are going on in the home, specifically in my area of adolescents who are at risk and homeless. They're not in a family system, so you can't necessarily get the history from the parent, and these kids are going through daily adjustment issues. So moving the field forward, what do you think can be done to help better capture the processes in real time?
Is that, I guess it's.
Sure, anybody.
Okay.
Yeah, why don't you start?
Well,
It's a great question.
yeah, well, in the service of trying to actually get a lot in, I didn't show a lot. Where'd she go? Oh, no. To show a lot of the data we have, but I think it's a very important point. So we've done a number of studies where we got the data right after an event and very proximal time points. And we can still model the same parameters. I mean, it's just actually better. In fact, we did, for example, a spinal cord injury study and a few other studies where we wanted to know what happens right after the injury. And we see still fairly recognizable patterns. I mean, everything we measure has got error built into it. So if you get finer and finer and finer, you're just getting more error. But I think we can do that. And, you know, a lot of the data sets I play around with are data sets that come my way. The national data sets are collaborators, and I take what I can get usually. So it's very nice to have the proximal data, but we can, and that fine tunes the measurement definitely, but you can do it either way. I mean, you just take into account what you've got.
I think it's a great question, and I think there's some great discussions of the issue of measurement in this regard. That our measurement timeframes have to fit with the processes and change we're trying to capture, and so some things, there's some things where if you measure it too quickly, you can't get a sense of the directionality because everything is embedded in covariation. If you take too long, you miss all the in-between processes and cascades. And there's some excellent discussions of that out there. But I think that to talk specifically to a shelter context, and you're talking about young people living in an emergency shelter, for example, one of the things that's always been striking to us is that this kind of situation provides a very unique opportunity to look very closely at some of the processes of change that are happening, day to day or even moment to moment, and over short periods of time, because you have acute changes going on in the environment for a lot of these young people. So I feel like we don't study unaccompanied children, but mostly families. But when you're in a shelter, I feel like it kind of opens a window on the acute adaptive processes. And it's complicated because these folks come in with so many things going on. But it can be, in some of the shelters I've worked with, the families live there. They eat at meals in cafeterias. They're extremely interested in understanding what's going on, and so it presents some important opportunities to watch and understand adaptation as it's unfolding for the shorter term, for these close-up processes. If you wanted to study more quick change or epigenetic changes related to entry, crises are always coming up for these people too. Every day there's a crisis coming up. Or if you want to monitor the relationship between sleep and epigenetic processes and executive function performance or something like that, it's a setting in which you could probably do some very important work.
Can I make one more point? Did you have a point? One more point which has occurred to me is that that depending on what the topic is, there are also nodal points that are very important to get. And I think Anne was saying something like that just now. I'm recently moving into researching cancer, how people react to getting cancer. And we've just been using this sort of bludgeoning approach of getting lots of data and tracking people over time. But with cancer, there are clear points of change. And we have to know what those points of change are and get data around those times. Just if you telescope out longer, everybody's talked a lot about developmental periods. And so depending on what the topic is, and if there's life in a shelter or a traumatic incident, or there typically are nodal points also, in addition to the proximal time to the event.
One last question for this session, but as Andrea is asking the question, could I have Christine and Michael and Marty go up and please join the panel, and we can spread the microphones out because we're going to get ready for our larger discussion. But go ahead with your question, Andrea.
So thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. I was just wondering, so flexibility is clearly important, but I also think that stability is important. The ability to predict future, to have expectation is important, and the absence of it could be quite costly, energetic. And this in some way parallels with some observation, for example, from Takao Hensch, where plasticity might be extremely useful in limited developmental period, but could be detrimental if it's a constant. So I was just wondering if you see flexibility as adaptive at any point, or if you think that flexibility is particularly important, for example.
That's really a great question. The question is about how is there a point when flexibility is no longer adaptive, or can it be too flexible? And I mean, you can think about curvilinear relationships, being so flexible that you change at a whim. But I think it's a very tricky question. When we